So this is a bit of a sprint through Southern African climate and ideas that people have had about why it's changed, when it's changed, and a new look that we have perhaps now based on a bunch of new data sets which we've collected from across the subregion. Theoretically, oh, there we go. So we're just going to do a quick background. We're going to look at the sources of evidence. We're going to look at orbital scale climate change and then millennial scale climate change, and then wrap up. So this is just the basic framework. Southern Africa, it's definitely a very complicated place to work because you have many different influences. Throughout this talk, I'm going to really simplify all of these elements. And if you find that I'm oversimplifying, come find me later, ask questions, because I'm definitely oversimplifying. We're going to look at just two primary circulation systems. The first one is the subtropical front and the westerly storm track. This brings winter rainfall. It's down there on the bottom there. This brings winter rainfall to the Cape, and its position changes over sort of longer timescales as a function of the position of the subtropical front, as perhaps linked to changes in Antarctic sea ice extent. The other system, the sort of converse system, and I'll be referring to that one in the future as sort of temperate systems. The other one is sort of the tropical systems, and this is defined in Southern Africa by the Southern Monsoon region, Southern African Monsoon region, which is part of the larger African rain belt. And obviously this is linked to insolation and sea surface temperatures in a very tight bond. Looking at rainfall seasonality across Southern Africa, this is the kind of pattern that these circulation systems create, where you have a winter rainfall zone down here on the southwestern Cape, and you have predominantly summer rain across most of the continent. People have conceptualized changes over longer time scales in different ways, but this from 76, and actually indeed the idea goes back even further, is that during glacial periods with reduced insolation, you have less tropical influence, less summer rain, and conversely, more winter rain. And this switches over into the interglacial. You have more insolation, warmer conditions, more potential for convection and tropical systems to influence the region. And the southern westerly shifts south, so there's less winter rain. So it's this A and B type of scenario simplified here. And this paradigm is one that is applied to almost all interpretations of all records since 1960, whatever. And it has some positive points, but obviously it's really simple. To explore this, we got evidence from a variety of sources from across Southern Africa. Most of these from the summer rainfall zone are all from tropical records that Louis Scott here has pretty much produced single-handedly. And then there's a new site that we have from Sevaviksport down right on the edge of the winter rainfall zone. We've made this information comparable, in a sense, taking all these sites together and using a technique developed by Manu Chevalier and myself and a couple other people. More or less where you just take the distribution of the plants, you apply that to pop it onto a climate grid, and create a series of PDFs through which you can look at how all the different pollen types, their affinities, and you can get a value for, in this case, aridity for a certain sample. And obviously you put these together for an entire sequence, you get a curve. These curves look like, oh, I knew that was going to happen, look like this, where we have temperature on the top and summer rainfall on the bottom. And indeed, during cooler periods, you have less summer rainfall, less tropical influence, and into the Holocene, that increases. Temperatures go up, summer rainfall goes up. Just as a quick reminder, this isn't actually linked to precession very tightly for most of the last 45,000 years, as is sometimes thought. This quick correlation between sea surface temperatures and the summer rainfall shows that it's predominantly sea surface temperatures that drive the signal, with the exception of the Holocene, which sort of pops up as a negative correlation with sea surface temperatures and a positive correlation with insolation. So there's, as global boundary conditions change, this relationship changes. Anyway, then we get to what I do, which is at Sevaviksport, where there are dussies, little hyraxes that live in little caves, and they have this particular habit of creating and using latrines. These stacks of fecal pellets and urine accumulate over thousands of years in a continuous manner. And you can have a meter plus sequence like this that spans 28, 30, 40, 50,000 years in some cases. These aren't like middens elsewhere. These aren't nests. This 2-centimeter section shows that they are highly laminated. It's more like a peleothem or something like that. And from this, we have pollen, phytoliths, ancient DNA, and stable isotopes. And I'm specifically going to look at the delta 15N for this talk, which has a relationship with aridity, where you can see here that tissues from both plants and animals become more enriched as it gets drier. These middens exist primarily in drier areas, so we're really looking at the most sensitive part of this curve. And obviously, there's a lot of talking that could go on around this. I'm not going to now. Using Manu's technique for a comparison, we see that reconstructions of aridity from pollen fit very well with the delta 15N signal. So just kind of take that as a given, and we'll move on from there. But if anybody has any questions, again, you can find me later. At Severviksport, we jumped off a bunch of cliffs, got a series of middens, and we've taken individual middens to create a composite sequence. The way this works is a lot of middens don't span much time, at least at this site. So we've popped them together to create something that looks more or less like a continuous sequence. But it doesn't always work so terribly well. Obviously, most of the middens follow a trend that is coherent and consistent. But the microclimatic effects of certain midden sites means that they have slightly different sensitivities. We've included them here just to be transparent and inclusive. And ultimately, when smoothing it over with less smoothing techniques or something like that, the dominant signal comes out in the wash. So this is what we have for the last 23,000 years at Severviksport. Using this to look at orbital change, again, taking sort of the northern summer rainfall zone as our tropical quote-unquote end member, and a record of actually sea salt sodium from Antarctica for our temperate end member. And that's, again, because sea salt sodium may well relate to sea ice extent, and that's thought to be the underlying driver of the position of the subtropical front and the westerly storm track. So you look at these, and yeah, it pops out where you have reduced tropical influence during the LGM, increasing into the Holocene, and vice versa in the sea salt sodium record. When you take the records that we have from near the winter rainfall zone and the zones from the sort of distal summer rainfall zone trending into the winter rainfall zone, again, you see those same dominant trends. So yes, the summer rainfall zone is drier during the last glacial maximum, and the southwestern Cape is wetter, and vice versa coming into the Holocene. So this idea of under colder conditions, you have more winter rain and less summer rain, and under warmer conditions, more summer and less winter. That seems to fit. So the paradigm that's been applied works at these orbital timescales. But with higher resolution records, we've been able to identify cases where this doesn't work. And even though these long-term trends fit, the millennial scale variability within them is not what you would call as consistent with the model. So we've taken just a cubic polynomial to take out the long-term low-frequency trends, de-trended the records, yes, and we've isolated what we feel to be generally millennial scale variability. What's interesting in this is that the relationship changes. So the tropical quote-unquote end member is in orange, and the southern summer rainfall zone is in yellow. And you can see that during the early part of the record, it's in phase. And then at the millennial scale, again, at the millennial scale, it is out of phase during the Holocene. And when you look at Severviksport versus sea ice extent, again, you have an out of phase during the early part of the record and an in phase in the later part of the record. And these are, oops, I'm going to lose the batteries here in a second. What you might imagine comes from this is that indeed the southern summer rainfall zone in Severviksport, while obviously not a one-to-one relationship at all, they express more similarities than you might imagine considering that they're in different rainfall zone regimes. Looking at this further and thinking about it, what was interesting was that when you correlate these detrended records, that the strongest correlation between tropical influence is actually during the last glacial maximum and deglacial period. And that during the Holocene, it's reduced. And the opposite exists between between the SSNA records, the temperate end member, and what we're seeing in the 70-foot records, where you have reduced temperate influence during the glacial period, and it's increased during the Holocene. That's really odd, because when you have temperate dominance, it's actually of the least importance at millennial timescales. And what's driving it are these little micro variations in the non-dominant system. And we were trying to think, why the hell would that happen? But looking at modern-day climatology, there's maybe a clue for this. Unfortunately, this doesn't quite hit it well. Obviously, a very pretty movie that you could lose yourself in. But look at the westerlies coming across here, and look at the tropical influence. And you can notice that each time one of these westerly troughs come through, rainfall lights up across the entire interior of southern Africa. These tropical temperate interactions, or tropical temperate troughs sometimes, actually account for an enormous amount of rainfall. But for them to exist, you cannot just have high convective potential or just strong westerly frontal systems. You need a combination of the two. And so the idea, sorry, I'll just skip over that. The idea that we have is that while indeed, over these long timescales, there is a coeval inverse response between temperate and tropical systems. This works. While this does work, at suborbital timescales, at millennial timescales, it's really quite the opposite. And there's an in-phase, spatially coherent pattern across much of the subcontinent. And that it's actually the weaker system that provides that spark to light up the dominant system through the creation of these unique synoptic systems. And you can have all the convective potential in the world, but if you don't have that westerly spark, you're not going to get this kicking off. And vice versa, you could have the westerly storm tracks just hammering the continent, but if there's no convective potential, if the tropical systems are so weak that there's none of the tropical moisture available to come through, you're going to have a much more limited response. So you need the two. So it's not an additive or a binary system. Really, at these timescales, for these really abrupt, significant events, you need to have something where they integrate and create this larger whole. So that's it for me.
I have one question related to how the signal is formed. So which physiological constraints are the background behind that? I think it's the P of the Hyrax. And how does changes in food webs, for example, change also your delta 15 values?
Yeah, it's a very good question. They're herbivores, so indeed issues of trophic level are out. And it's a very poorly understood mechanism. It has to do with essentially denitrification in the soils. And when we've done, I'm not sure if you saw Andy Carr's poster a few days back, but there is an empirical relationship between changes in delta 15 and enrichment at the soil level. And again, under more humid conditions, it's a very weak relationship. And at in very arid conditions, like less than 50 millimeters per year, it falls off as well. But in the sweet spot where we're working, it's really quite a strong relationship. And the idea is that the isotopic signature of the plants reflects these changes in the soils. The animals eat the plants, and that's transferred, obviously with fractionation across the process, to being more or less directly transferred from water availability in the soil to the animal tissues and therefore in the urine. And just as a by and by, we have probably a couple dozen sequences across southern Africa. And while being different, obviously, because it's a heterogeneous region climatically, they're all very consistent with independent records. So even though we're not quite sure of the exact mechanism, it does seem to be quite robust.
Thank you, everybody, for coming this morning and for giving me this opportunity to share some of my results of the speleothem research I've been doing on the south coast of South Africa. And Brian mentioned at the beginning of his talk, climate in South Africa is very complicated. So I'm going to talk as well about the importance of connectivity between the tropics and the temperate climate regions in South Africa. But I might contradict what he said in some parts of my talk, so I hope he's going to be nice about it. Yeah. So I don't have to go too much into detail about this, but one of the important characteristics of South African climate is the seasonality that we have, with mostly summer rain in the interior and winter rain on the west coast. And my research site is here at Pinnacle Point on the central south coast, where we get year-round rainfall. And this is related to very complex synoptic conditions that are related to interactions between tropical and temperate systems. So Engelbrecht and Landmann have kind of investigated the synoptic conditions that lead to rainfall in this area, and they came up with, by using self-organizing maps, feeding in the synoptic conditions between 1978 and 2011, with a total of 6 different types of synoptic conditions that cause rainfall. And when we think about the isotopes of oxygen-stable isotopes of speleothemes, I think these 3 are some of the most important ones. So we have the pressure conditions here in the maps on the left side, and meridionally integrated moisture flux on the right. So there are 2 conditions here on the top, the ridges to the southwest and the troughs to the southeast, that are similar in a way, in that they have kind of high pressure conditions towards the west or southwest of the country, and then a low pressure system towards the southeast. And that leads to northward advection of moisture from the ocean. And these lead to 46% and 7% of rainfall on the south coast, respectively. Then the tropical temperate troughs form usually when we have a strong summer heat low, and this heat low is able to connect up with the westerlies. And that leads to actually southward moisture migration over the continent. So it also is a major provider of rainfall to large parts of the interior of South Africa. But it also leads to about 28% of the rainfall on the south coast. So it's really important for the area that I'm looking at. I wanted to look a little bit more into the seasonality of these systems. So because we need this strong summer heat low to create tropical temperate troughs, they, of course, occur most commonly in the summertime, and they are less common in the winter. And then these troughs to the southeast, they are more common in the wintertime, whereas the ridges to the southwest, they kind of occur year-round. So they are just kind of providing a background signal of these more mixed isotopic compositions in the rainfall. So here in the bottom, I'm showing the monthly weighted average delta 18O of rainfall at Mossel Bay, which is about 10 kilometers away from our cave sites. And we sampled rainfall over there starting in 2006 and 2007, and we added up onto that between 2009 and 2012. So this is an over 4-year-long record of rainfall sampling that we have available now. And we can see that summer rainfall has much higher isotopic compositions than winter rainfall. And I attribute that to these changes in the synoptic conditions. I can't go into details because that would be a talk in itself. But yeah, I think that if we think about the speleotheme stable oxygen isotopes, that what we see are long-term changes between these tropical temperate troughs and the troughs towards the southeast. So the other proxy I'm looking at is carbon isotopes in the speleothemes, and in areas like South Africa, where we have these strong changes in the seasonality, it is very common to see also differences in the vegetation types. So we have mostly grasslands and savannas in the interior, and then the fynbos biome on the south coast. And this is related to differences in the abundance of C3 and C4 vegetation, which has a strong effect on the isotopic composition of soil CO2, and that can be transferred into the speleothemes. So here are my records. These are actually composite records of a total of 12 samples from 2 cave sites at Pinnacle Point. And we can see there's quite some variability. The delta 13C, if we for a second ignore this little peak there, kind of has more or less stable amplitude throughout the record. So this part is from one cave called Staircase Cave. The younger part here on the left is from a second site that we call PP29. So they don't really overlap in time. But I think the delta 13C does really well represent the environment. And, but the delta 18O, we do see that there's kind of a difference in the amplitude. And we do have a record that was published in 2010 from this area by Matthews et al. That overlaps with PP29, and we can see this again, that the amplitude here is much lower. So I think that there are some factors at play at PP29 that might cause this reduced amplitude. But the delta 13C actually overlaps pretty well between the 2 overlapping cave sites. So I think that we do see an environmental signal here. Okay. So the next thing I wanted to do is to look at other paleoclimatic records from the region that might reflect some of the rainfall systems that are influential on the south coast. So one of the records that I found was this record from the Walvis Ridge that was published in 2002 by Stud et al. That has been interpreted to reflect river runoff from the Orange River. So this is the Orange River and all of its tributaries. And we can see that nowadays most of this is located in the summer rainfall region that gets a lot of its rainfall from these tropical temperate troughs. So when we compare the record to the speleothemes, so here in purple is the river runoff from the Orange River with more humid conditions in the top and more arid conditions in the bottom. We can see that specifically the delta 18O from Staircase Cave shows correlation to this record. The delta 13C shows the signal a little bit less clear, and but if we take out the low values that we find in stage 6 that I think are related to colder conditions favoring C3 plants, there still is low correlation between the 2 records. Yeah, the younger part is a little bit more tricky. I think it might be related to the fact that we only have 2 tie points for the age model for the marine record in this part, one at about 40,000 and one at about 90,000 years. But another thing that I plotted here is the precession parameter, and we can see that a lot of the peaks that we see in these records actually kind of just follow after a precession peak. And there are just a few exceptions from this, and these happen during interglacials. So here's the idea that I have for what's happening here. So when the precession parameter is low, we have a weak continental heat low, and therefore we get reduced connectivity with the westerlies during these periods. And that leads to reduced rainfall in the interior, as well as a more kind of winter rainfall signal in the speleothemes on the south coast. Then when the precession parameter is increased, we get a strong continental heat low that is able to connect with the westerlies more frequently. And that leads to more rainfall in the interior and a summer rainfall signal or a mixed rainfall signal on the south coast. And then during these peak interglacial phases, we might have a strong continental heat load if the precession is high, but the westerlies, if they are shifted south, would not be able to connect with this heat low, and that then again leads to reduced rainfall in the interior and winter rainfall on the south coast. So these are the conclusions. I think that the delta 18O of rainfall on the south coast is related to changes in the synoptic conditions, and that's what we see in the speleothem records. The variations in summer insolation and the position of the westerlies lead to changes in the frequencies at which we get specific synoptic conditions. And these are also reflected in the speleothems. And then a delta 13C is very likely to reflect changes in the proportions of C3 and C4 vegetation. Just during stage 6, this might be offset towards C3 plants because of the colder conditions. Okay, thank you.
So you interpret Stu's record in the opposite way that he does, and I'm not saying either one of you is wrong or right, but how do you imagine, is there a volume? It's quite loud, I think, isn't it? How does that, how do you imagine that sediment gets there? Because now most of the sediment flows south from the Orange River into the mud belt, and very little of it actually goes north. Do you imagine that circulation dynamics were so significantly changed? I mean, we're talking, I think it's along the lines of 90% of the muds flow south.
I wasn't aware of that, actually, to be honest. Now it's not working. So do you think... Yes. Okay.
C3 or C4, but there's an abundance of succulent plants at that site.
Yes.
So it's not just C3 and C4, there's CAM, and that's a function of aridity, which may also...
Yes, so the thing about so we have in my group a recent PhD graduate that she looked at micromammals from the archaeological sites that we are working at, and she did a very detailed analysis of the delta 13C values in the plants in this area. And I think for the most part, even the CAM plants in this region overlap very well with C3 plant species. So if we get the C3 signal, even if it's CAM plants, we would probably expect that that's more of winter rainfall kind of. I think, the thing is that I need at least 300 milliliters of rainfall to get speleothem deposition. So I think that we can't say much about aridity in this area. I think there was always enough, when I have deposition, there was always enough rainfall for that. But yeah, I mean, there might be there's a lot of noise in my records, so I mean, there's a lot of other factors that are probably very important too.
Hola y muy buenos días a todos. That's just a test for my microphone. Hello and welcome everyone to my talk about flood history in lake sediments from southwestern Ecuador and whether the sediments do reflect El Nino or not. The El Nino Southern Oscillation is a dominant source of interannual climate variability in the tropics, and it is significant on ecosystems as well as also on societies. However, actually very little is known about ENSO variability on decadal to millennial scales, but exactly this information is fundamental to understand ENSO behavior in the perspective of global warming. ENSO reconstructions, however, they help to extend the empirical evidence of ENSO beyond instrumental data. This figure from Émile G. and colleagues in 2013 shows an overview for different El Nino or ENSO reconstructions, multi-proxy as well as also single proxies, and also different models for the last 1,000 years. One hardly can see it here. However, as one can see, there are many different inconsistencies in those records. Mostly that's due to chronological uncertainties, as well as also to different teleconnections, and also due to not stable proxy climate signals. Moreover, also Holocene long ENSO reconstructions are rare. However, in 1999, this iconic publication was established by Donald T. Rothbell and colleagues, and which was about an approximately 15,000 year record of El Nino-driven alluviation in southwestern Ecuador. They cored a 9-meter-long core from this lake up here, Laguna Paicacocha, which is just sited on the eastern side of the climatic divide. And they could relate those light layers here with alluvial activity. So they are representing flood events. Moreover, they established a chronology, and they could connect the whole thing with El Nino alluviation. So they found that during early and mid-Holocene, there was a lower frequency of El Nino, and towards present, rather higher frequency. Their hypothesis is that during El Nino, convective precipitation takes place here on the western side of the Andes, and that this leads to heavy precipitation in this area. However, more recent studies from, for example, Wu and colleagues are showing that actually the precipitation up there should be driven by easterly wind flows, bringing moisture from the Amazonian basin as well as also from Atlantic up there to the park. So we have two different hypotheses. This one here would rather speak for La Nina-driven events. That's why we went also to this region, and we also were looking whether we find late Holocene flood records from multiple lakes. So we also investigated 2 more lakes, and moreover, we got access to meteorological data, which was not there for the last study, or the last 2 studies, and we got access to 9 different meteorological stations up there. So our second question was whether there is any relation between intense precipitation and El Nino phases in this region. Here's an overview on the site. The 3 lakes are located in the Cajas National Park, which reaches from 3,100 meters to up to 4,200 meters. Laguna Fondococha and Paicacocha are at 4,000 meters, and Laguna Yavayuco at roughly 3,000 meters. Here you have 3 pictures. Moreover, the yellow stations here are representing meteorological stations, and as we can see, we also have some directly in the national park. So we went to the 3 lakes, we cored them, and back at Bern, at our laboratory, we split the cores, and then we did several analyses. We measured micro-XRF, with micro-XRF scans, sediment elemental composition of the sediment, as well as also with hyperspectral imaging. We checked for visual spectra, which are significant in order to distinguish those flood layers. Moreover, we also subsampled the cores, did standard analysis. We collected all the data in a big matrix, and we analyzed it using a principal component analysis as well as also k-means cluster analysis in order to see whether we can do an objective flood layer classification. Moreover, we also had a less objective classification using visual inspection. So 3 individual people were counting and measuring all those layers, and that gave quite a nice data set. Then for each lake, we established a chronology, and together we could assign to each layer an age, and we could calculate flood layer frequencies. Here I'm showing you one example. That's Laguna Paicacocha. That's a principal component biplot. And here we have the scree plot. So we see only principal component 1, which explains more than 70% of the variance is significant. And if we plot this along our core picture, that's a near-infrared picture of the core to have better contrast. We see here that's the individual classification by the 3 individual countings, and down here we have the principal component 1 colored according to the k-means clusters, which are actually representing those layers very well. So we use this information to establish a flood layer corrected chronology, because we are interested only in the real sedimentation, which is cleared by rapid sediment events. As I said, we calculated for each lake then flood layer frequencies using a 100-year moving window. And here on top we have Laguna Fondococha, Laguna Yaviuca, and Paicacocha. And as you can see, we only extend back to 2,000 years from today. And the colored shadings are representing the minimum, the maximum, and the mean values of the countings, and the black line or curve per lake is the more objective approach with the principal component analysis. Blue asterisks are representing chronological markers. However, one would expect, if we would have a significant fingerprint of the atmospheric activity, that those three layers, which are located in the same region, should show the same frequency. Obviously, they don't do that. We have some inconsistencies as well. We explain that due with more significant fingerprints from the watershed activity. If you plot now along also the two reconstructions from the former studies, from the grayscale values here from Rothbell et al. And red units from Moy et al., one sees that both do not show exactly the same frequency. That's due to the improvement in age model. And moreover, Moy et al., they showed that with 100 years non-overlapping windows, that actually the El Niño frequency is decreasing. However, Conroy et al. In 2008, they cored a lake El Yunco, which is just sited in the center of action of the El Niño on Galapagos, and they actually found that towards present the El Niño was more frequent. So what's going on? That's why we then analyzed meteorological data. We calculated 24 hours and 72 hours precipitation sums, set two different thresholds, 95% and 99%, in order to only analyze the intense precipitation and compare the resulting dates of those intense precipitation events to 14 different monthly resolved ENSO indices. Moreover, we also calculated composite maps of intense precipitation using NCEP and CAR data. I'm just showing you a short example here. That's one specific ENSO index, Hadis 1 Niño zone 1 and 2. We overplotted this. It's going from 2002 to 2016. And we overplotted simply from one station, Cancan Soldados, the resulting intense precipitation events at the 99th percentile, we're resulting with 26 events. And then we simply compared whether it was occurring during La Nina, neutral phase, or El Nino phase. So we counted 100% here are summing up the 26 events, and we just counted during which phase how many events occurred. This we did for all the 14 different ENSO indices. What we clearly see, it's quite a colorful picture, which means we cannot clearly say that intense precipitation is only occurring during El Nino. Moreover, we did this for all the other stations here, just the four closest one to the park, and one sees exactly the same. So we do not see only red faces, which would represent El Nino. So if we overplot now those 26 events at the 500 hectopascal geopotential height, and for relative humidity, as well as also for wind direction and wind strength, one sees that actually the moisture is coming from the either Atlantic region or from Amazonian basin. So we totally agree, those flood layers are classic lamina, resulting from alluvial activity. Moreover, that the flood frequency are not consistent. They rather represent local features than bigger atmospheric pictures, and that the intense precipitation can occur during El Niño, La Niña, or neutral phase, and moreover that probably one of the that Paikakocha is highly probable to not relate to Paleo El Niño only, and that it's overprinted by other things. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Just to comment on the Met station data, it's very short time interval you have, and you don't actually capture any strong to very strong El Nino events in those windows. So without having 98, 99, or 82, 83 in your meteorological window, how can you make a statement that during the truly strong El Nino events, which is what the original paper claimed to be recording, just the very strong events, that you're not getting convective activity off the Eastern Pacific?
Thanks. Yes, thanks for this very nice question. Of course, that's very true. We are limited in the meteorological data lengths. However, here we have one station, Gualaceo, which goes back to 1964. And so this one also shows exactly the same picture.
To the east.
Sorry?
That's way too far to the east and way too low to possibly pick up convective activity off of the Pacific. Even the Cuenca Met data have always shown that there's no El Nino signal in Cuenca.
Yeah, exactly.
So I just don't see how you can make the claim that based on the Met data, you can rule out convective Pacific-derived moisture making it up to the meteorological divide.
Yes, okay, I see that. So we would expect in our records, so we can go from the sedimentological part, then we would expect to have a similar overall pattern in the watershed, I think. So that the two close nearby lakes, Fondococha as well as Paikakocha, just would show the same frequencies will pop up, I think.
Well, there are hundreds of lakes on the Cajas Plateau, the great majority of which will not show any flood frequency because they have no hydrologic connection to fine-grained clastic material that's going to get entrained during big rain events. So to pick two lakes that are, Paikakocha is a very unusual site because its headwaters are in the very erosive ignimbrite material that will be entrained in debris flows and end up in the lake. So obviously other lakes, almost all other lakes are not going to show that strong a signal as Paikakocha.
Yes, exactly. Then the other thing is, I think we need to think also about proxy reconstructions, that they should be reproducible. And if we take, again, a core in the same lake or region, we should get exactly, from the same lake, we should get exactly the same frequency. But somehow, with the uncertainties in age models or whatever, we don't see exactly the same picture as has been published previously.
Well, the drainage basin characteristics have to be the same, and there are very few lakes that would match the drainage basin characteristics of Paikakocha. Certainly Yavayuku does not. It's at the end of a paternoster sequence of lakes. There's no way that clastic material is going to get into that during a flood event.
Exactly. Yavayuku is connected to a further up lake, which should dampen the signal. However, the really big events we should still see, because it could erode still material, so it would actually be a filter. What we also see in the lower frequency overall over the 100 years. So thanks a lot, and I guess we should catch up.
Paikakocha does not have recorded any flood events since approximately 1960. So 82, 83, and 97, the really big El Niños are missing, don't show anything. Secondly, the paper arguing for strong precipitation, which was published by Horel in 86, shows exactly that he compared the 82-83 precipitation across a transect from Guayaquil to the interior of the Andes. That paper precisely shows that enhanced precipitation is limited to the coastal area, low elevation, and if you go, and that is in his figure 6 of that paper, if you go to the high Andes during the El Nino 82-83 did not show any increased precipitation. So the question is, of course, one may argue we need more stations, we need more long records, but in contrast, what is the evidence that intense precipitation at Paikakocha is really related to warm ENSO events? We find in our analysis that it's equal probability, positive, negative, neutral, and therefore, in some cases, it may represent ENSO, in other cases, it may not, but that is not known.
Just to clarify, it doesn't contain the 98 event because we took it in 93.
We have, in your paper, you argued that, say, the missing layer in 82 might be due to coring, the surface disturbed. We have completely undisturbed gravity cores, where we can see in repeated cores in all lakes, 97 and 82 is not present.
We should be moving on, sorry. I guess you can continue this discussion over lunch.
I feel almost reluctant to step up now because that debate around the interpretation of those sediments is fascinating, and it's really important that we continue to question the traces that we use to interpret past climates. It's fun. Yeah, very good. Okay, so I'll be talking today about Holocene environmental variability in southeastern Australia, specifically from the sediments from West Basin. This is West Basin here. And in particular, I'd like to acknowledge my various collaborators, but especially in green here, 5 students who've contributed an awful lot to this research. And also to AINSI, the Australian Institute for Nuclear Science and Energy, for funding the research. So I don't think it really, this has been covered fairly robustly in recent days here at the conference, but Australia has a huge vested interest in understanding hydrological variability through time. There's an enormous economic, environmental, societal effects of large-scale droughts resulting from reduction in rainfall, increased evaporation, fires, leading to loss of biodiversity and, of course, economic loss. There's also, of course, a great deal of international relevance to studying hydrological variability in Australia, since it sits right in the middle of these really important global climatic drivers, the El Nino Southern Oscillation, or the Interdecadal Pacific Oscillation, the Indian Ocean Dipole, IOD, the Southern Annular Mode. And so, we're really targeting more high-quality climate records from Australia so that we can better understand the sort of spatial dynamics of these processes. Our study areas down here in southeastern Australia, where very similar to southern Africa, we receive the majority of rainfall today in the winter via these westerly winds, although occasionally we get rainfall off the east coast or even off the northwest coast, particularly in summer months. If we look at how relevant the climate variability in southeastern Australia is to the wider region, we can see here on the left a correlation diagram plotting the correlation between rainfall at Penshurst, near to our study site, across the wider southeastern or southern Australian region. You can see that most of this area is kind of characterised by similar conditions. Those conditions are Mediterranean-like, i.e. we have very hot summers, relatively cooler winters, and the majority of rainfall today falling in the winter. This is rainfall variability in southeastern Australia for the last 100 years, and you can see that it exhibits very strong decadal scale variability. And one of the challenges then, therefore, is how do we forecast hydrological change into the future, given the wide variability in the recent past, and how characteristic is this scale variability when we go into longer time scales? Hence the need for better paleoclimate reconstructions. So today I'll talk about the Holocene and how the evolution of the environment in southeastern or in Victoria and southeastern Australia But the main focus of the research is really targeted at the last 2,000 years to try and understand shorter timescale variability. So if we think about the last 2K, there are plenty of very good records from Australasia. For example, the Australian and New Zealand Drought Atlas based on tree ring research. But you can see that the glaring issue here. We've got estimates for precipitation over evaporation, drought risk across eastern Australia, but those estimates are based almost entirely on remote data sets, tree ring records from New Zealand and Tasmania, with very, very few data contributing to this from the actual mainland of Australia. Similarly, a lot of importance is placed on the Antarctic ice cores, or Lord Dome especially, for tracing or reconstructing hydrological change in eastern Australia through the last 1,000 years in this case. But again, we're basically reconstructing rainfall or reconstructing hydrological balance in eastern Australia from extremely remote sources of information. Okay? And so how constant those teleconnections are, or how stationary they are, is of course a major issue, or major question. And so our mission, I suppose you might put it, is to extend our understanding of hydroclimatic variability in southeastern Australia using lakes. And as Bronwyn Dixon showed yesterday, we actually have hundreds of lake or sediment records for eastern Australia, but generally they lack the resolution, the chronology, and the necessary quantifiable climatic traces to really solve some of those sort of human-relevant problems. And in our group in Adelaide, we're working on all of these things. We're attempting to develop and validate various different types of environmental traces for hydrological balance and rainfall, including development of sort of proxy system models, as we might call them, or isotope, in particular isotope-enabled hydrological models for the lakes that we're studying. But today I'm really going to focus on the West Basin record, which I would argue is providing an improved resolution and improved chronology on some of these events. And so this is West Basin. It's a Mayr crater lake. Has a diameter of only about 500 meters, so it's a fairly small puddle in western Victoria, about 2 to 3 hours west of Melbourne. Okay? There are two basins, two Mayrs right next to each other, East Basin and West Basin, both of which have been studied extensively in the late 1980s and early 90s. Research led by Patra de Decker and Bill Last at Manitoba. Also a paper by Peter Gell and others on the diatoms from the Holocene core from this lake. And so those guys studied this core WB3, and the work I'm about to present now is taken here, WB2. The reason that I became interested in West Basin is the presence of these fine laminations that go through the full 5.5 meter length of the core. And so my initial sort of optimism about this site was centered around the potential that there might be varves in these laminations might be varved. This is a gravity core we took a couple of years ago. So this is the modern day sediment water interface. You can see that these laminations are still accumulating. They consist of largely carbonates, but also lithic material. And then this is an X-radiograph of the first meter of the WB2 core. And you can polished using this Core Lab software by Steve Abrocta. And you can see that right through that 1 meter of sediment, we've got these fine laminations. And this is the L-star lightness of the measure of the intensity, the brightness of that X-ray. The short story there is that the situation with these laminations is actually very complicated. They're not necessarily consistent carbonate organic couplets. And so they're very difficult actually to build a proper chronology around because there's no real continuous cycle. I'd argue that there's still potential there to build a varve chronology, but it needs some really, really detailed microfacies analysis to solve that. As I say, that the laminations are carbonate. They're actually, a lot of the laminations are carbonate, dominated by endogenic dolomite. So it's a very rare system where we have the precipitation of dolomite out of the water column. Again, this was studied by Last and de Decker, and this is their XRD measurement of the concentration of carbonates through a similar 5-meter core. And then we've passed our core through the iTrax core scanner at Anstow near Sydney in Australia, and you can see that the calcium titanium of that generated by that iTrax scanner really well represents the concentration of carbonates in this core. There has been some debate as to whether the dolomites in these sediments are precipitated within the sediments. However, they tend to have these rhomboidal crystal structures. We've been trapping sediment for the last 2 years at West Basin, and we're collecting them in the water column. We actually collect them all over the sediment trap. So the evidence suggests that these are actually precipitated out of the water column rather than a diagenetic signal. We have been dating pollen and in yellow and coarse organic material in blue to generate so far just 12 radiocarbon dates. We've got another 25 waiting in the lab to be analysed, so we should have a very detailed chronology for this core. But as you can see, at the moment, through the last 11,000 years, it implies a relatively consistent sedimentation rate. And here are the data. So up here on the top, we've got the titanium and the calcium titanium of the generated by iTrax core scanning, total organic carbon, carbon to nitrogen ratio, and the delta 13C of the organic material. And you can see, generally speaking, throughout the last 11,000 years, we have this transition from a more lithic-dominated system in the earlier Holocene, so a lot of titanium, a lot of clays in these sediments, and then the gradual shift from a more carbonate-dominated system in the late Holocene. The organic content is relatively constant, bar a few sort of. Oh dear. Okay, better move on quickly. Just to focus quickly on the delta 13C. Once we start to get these carbonates precipitating out of the water column, then they're drawing out the heavy isotopes, and so they're causing these sharp negative declines in delta 13C. Comparing that to, we've got Palcacacha down here, I'll come to that in a second, but comparing it to two established lake depth reconstructions by Dan Wilkins, based on the original Bowler paper from the early 1970s, from Lake Keelenbeat and Lake Notuk, we can see that our transition from lithic to carbonate-dominated system agrees well with the sort of regional signal for lake shallowing through this period. And so, the hypothesis is that these carbonates are precipitating due to the concentration of carbonate ions due to evaporation. We can also see quite an interesting comparison with the Moy et al. Red intensity, irrespective of how we may interpret those data. And just to look at it in more detail, we can see that as we're having more and more of these carbonate precipitation events in West Basin, they do compare very favorably with the lamination deposition in Palcacacha. So irrespective of whether we read this as an El Nino proxy, we can see this pattern of essentially more frequent dry events in Australia corresponding with more frequent wet events in Ecuador. And this also can be seen if we look at the cross-waveless analysis between these two records. We can see this intensification of this 2,000-year periodicity in the late Holocene, although it's not necessarily in phase, maybe due to age uncertainties. If we look in more detail at the more recent sediments, so this is just the last 1,000 years now, and this is inverted, I'm sorry. So we've got calcium titanium high at the bottom and low at the top. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'll get there. We can see that there's quite a strong sort of 200-year cyclicity in the data, but the interpretation is slightly more complex because we've got more salty conditions as inferred by diatoms, the diatom salinity transfer function. So where we actually have fewer carbonates in the shorter time scale, they occur in more salty conditions. Okay? This is also backed up by comparing the calcium titanium organized ordinarily now against instrumental precipitation. So we have more calcium titanium in wetter decades compared to drier decades. And I think this is because once we reach this state of carbonate supersaturation in the lake, then it becomes limited by, say, magnesium to produce these dolomites, and that requires some sort of water to transfer the magnesium into the lake. So getting close to the end now. So we can see, as I say, this strong, very clear periodicity through the last 1,000 years, where we interpret wetter and drier events through that period. And these compare quite nicely with the Law Dome reconstruction of the interdecadal Pacific Oscillation, such that when we have positive IPO, we tend to see drier conditions in Victoria. And that's in line with the idea that these positive IPOs are more long-lived sort of El Nino-like conditions. At the bottom here, we've just got the moving window cross-correlation, just showing that where we see red here, that there's general correlation between the two, but allowing some sort of flexibility for the uncertain timescale, uncertain chronology for West Basin. And so, finally, we might then infer that this periodic oscillation between wetter and drier conditions at West Basin might then inform us as to the nature of the last 2,000 years or beyond, and might provide useful sort of means to better understand the drought risk in these regions. Okay, to summarize then, we can say that lake sediments do have potential, I think, to address some of these important questions related to regional and hemispheric climate variability. We have essentially, at the moment, a qualitative tracer for hydrological change that we're working to quantify. We have this strong 2,000-year periodicity that kicks in the mid-Holocene, and then another sort of 200-year periodicity that appears quite strongly in the last few thousand years. Okay, thank you.
Today I'd like to speak to you about a portion of my research on climate and fire-mediated terrestrial aquatic ecosystem interactions. So fire is a very important agent for landscape change worldwide, and here is a map demonstrating the occurrence of fire per year. And as you can see, Australia has many fires per year, and this is very important to the landscape, as John so nicely pointed out, the importance of hydroclimate in this region. And so scientists have been trying to understand these relationships of fire to the terrestrial ecosystem and landscape. So we can see that there are relationships to productivity as well with fire frequency, as well as trying to better understand the relationship of fire to the ecological relationships to climate, vegetation type, and soil fertility, understanding of fire return interval with certain vegetation biomes, as well as alternative vegetation states depending on fire frequency. However, we don't have a real understanding of how aquatic ecosystems relate to the influences of fire, and that's where my research comes in. So here's a broad schematic demonstrating some of the relationships from climate to aquatic ecosystems. So we have these more direct relationships that are more studied with aquatic ecosystem paleo records, so changes in temperature, precipitation, or lake level change. But what is less understood is the relationship to climate in the indirect fashion through the terrestrial ecosystem, such as vegetation change, nutrient inputs, and changes in erosion. And particularly as well, the influences of fire through this system. And that's what I'd like to speak to today, is how is fire influencing the aquatic ecosystem. And a little bit about, as well, this relationship with the terrestrial ecosystem changes. So to my site, like Christina mentioned, my site is in Tasmania, off the southeast coast, island off the southeast coast of Australia, and sits right here in the western region of Tassie, which is heavily forested and wet compared to the eastern side, just kind of demonstrated by this red line. So Lake Vera is the site. As you can see in this photo, it's heavily rainforested. It's oligotrophic/dystrophic acidic. It's quite deep. It's 50 meters deep, and what we believe to be muriomictic. So I am using diatoms to understand the changes in the aquatic ecosystem and comparing them to pollen. So this site has actually been cored. We're recording it for the third time, but I'll explain why we've coring it so many times. So McPhail in 1979 cored it in this very shallow sedge region of the lake to do a pollen reconstruction of the vegetation. And a diatom record was taken, but I'll show you why we've redone the coring. And then Fletcher et al. Has cored it in a slightly deeper part of the basin to do a charcoal and vegetation record, is what I'll be comparing my diatoms to today. And then we've recorded again at the very deep basin at 50 meters to get a longer record of better preservation of the diatoms. So as I mentioned, there has been diatoms done on this site, but from that very shallow basin, you get very poor preservation and resolution. So you only have a record really from 7,000 to 11.5 thousand years from Bradbury. All right, so moving on just to the vegetation history at the site. For anyone who's interested, this is the pollen stratigraphy. I'm not going to get into it, but that's from Fletcher et al. In review. And as well, here's a summary diagram of the vegetation that I'll just point out a few important curves that I'd like to relate to climate and what I'll be talking about with my diatoms. So they got a 0 to 19,000 year record from the pollen. And what's really interesting about Lake Vira, which is not typical of Tasmania, that there's a long period absent of fire in this region. So this is the charcoal scores from the lake. So there's about 8,000 years free of fire. However, we are still seeing vegetation change responding to these climatic shifts. So we're seeing an increase in ferns during a dry period from 12,000 to 8,000 years. And then a shift into wetter conditions where we get an increase in Eucryphia rainforest taxa from 8,000 to 5,000. This curve is a regional charcoal curve. It's from the same mountain, but not the same lake. So we're seeing the drying that's regional, but not necessarily local. So we're seeing an early drying from this regional curve at 5,000 years, which is related to increased frequency of El Nino. And then when fire kicks in at 2,000 years at Lake Vira, we're seeing that increased response and resurgence of ferns with fire. So that's a brief overview of the vegetation history. And now I'd like to get into some of my results from this core. So this is our age model. We have 5 lead-210 dates, which are demonstrated on the right by the age and the activity of the lead-210. We have 19 radiocarbon dates, which were all macrofossils. So we get, using Bayesian age modeling, we get a really nice age model with just about 2 outliers. So from the deeper basin, we only got 8,000, a basal date of 8,000 years. And this is just has very high sedimentation in the middle of that core. The middle of the lake, sorry. Okay, so now just moving on to my diatom record. And just, I know stratigraphies can be overwhelming. I'm just going to very briefly go through the ecological changes we see. So as I did mention, the deep basin, we only actually got a date down to 8,000 years. However, that Fletcher core went much longer, so I have done the diatoms in the bottom of that core to get a longer record, but understanding that this is a slightly discontinuous record, but still gives us a nice story of the ecological changes over the late Pleistocene Holocene. So in the beginning of the record, from 14,000 to 10,000 years, we're seeing these more disturbance, oligotrophic, more alkaline taxa. And then we get a shift around 9,000 to 2,000 years to more acidic taxa, so and a gentle incline in some of these taxa, so more acidity coming in to 2,000 years. We're also seeing this interesting increase in these Discotella stolidura, which are planktonic and also have wide ecological tolerances in temperate lakes. So they're also associated with some nutrient affinity, as well as been demonstrated to respond to changing and mixing depth. I mean, it's very short but important change in the record from 2,000 to 1,000 years of increased disturbance in more alkaline taxa, and then back to these more acidic taxa from 900 to 0. All right. So now I just kind of want to put together the terrestrial changes at the site with my aquatic stuff and try to explain what I think is going on here. So just the bottom is age from 0 to 16,000 years. And again, we have that charcoal record from Lake Vira. And then I've lumped some of the important vegetation types from the pollen, so trees, ferns, and non-arboreal. Again, our Discotella stolidura diatom. And then we have run geochemistry on this course. So this is the incoherence-coherence from the XRF scanning, demonstrating lower on that axis, more detrital inputs. And then the PCA axis 1 score for the diatoms, and I've also performed a pH reconstruction on the diatoms with a weighted averaging partial least squares, understanding the issues with transfer functions, and more I just want to look at the trends rather than the values, and that these trends actually do nicely match my ecological interpretations of the diatom record. And then here I've also put this Legostrobus taxa, which is a drought-tolerant taxa, and then at the top again that regional charcoal curve from Frenchman's Cap, but not local necessarily. So what I believe we're seeing here is natural landscape development with you're getting more vegetation on the landscape, increasing those organic humic soils around the catchment. And then eventually you start to get more of an increase in rainforest taxa development, which eventually will leach these base cations from the soils, lowering buffering capacity, and then slowly decreasing the pH of the lake. And so this is termed lake ontogeny. Then some more regional signals is we see that there's some increased drying in the region associated with slight declines in pH. So here we have that drought-tolerant taxa increasing when we have a real dip in our pH reconstruction. So those are the changes that are occurring kind of absent of fire. So this was a really good site to kind of understand what's going on when you have fire events and when you have no fire events. So that's what we're kind of seeing, this lake ontogeny process. So once the fire kicks in at 2,000 years, we're seeing two kind of important trends. So we see this increase in alkalinity of the diatoms, which is associated with increased ash deposition, which contains more base cations, buffering more of the acidity and increasing the alkalinity of the lake. As well, we're seeing more detrital and terrestrial inputs off of the landscape, associated with increased erosion and turbidity of the lake, allowing less light to penetrate within that water column, and then favoring these Discotellus salidra. So now I'd like to just kind of compare some of my results to some of the literature. So this other lake has demonstrated that an increase in charcoal is associated with increase in diatom inferred pH. So that's promising. As well as by Saros and Anderson in 2015, they've created this realized niche plot. So I'm just going to, Cyclotella sensulata is including this Discotella. And they've created, the colors are the abundance. So that being high in the red color. So we have mixing depth here and then the nitrate. So you can see that there's some association with the abundance with slight increases in nutrients. But what seems to be more important is this change in mixing depth. So lower mixing depth is more important for this taxon. So I think that shows some interesting relationships with our increased fire, potentially declining lower mixing depth, and then we get a pulse in these taxa. So to conclude, we're observing lake ontogeny, the natural acidification of the aquatic ecosystem during fire-free periods at Lake Vira. We're also demonstrating some evidence of dry condition with increased acidity of the lake. And then once we have an onset of fire activity, we're getting two important responses. So we get an increase in alkalinity due to increased ash deposition and base cations that come into the lake. And secondly, increased erosion causing turbidity and lowering mixing depth, favoring those important planktonic taxa. So thank you very much.
How much weight can you place on interpreting changes in Tasmanian diatoms based on information gathered in the northern hemisphere? How confident are you that they're actually the same species or have the same sort of ecological responses?
I have gone through quite a bit into Wim Biverman's work to make sure that as many of the diatoms I could make sure were the endemic Tasmanian diatoms, and I've also used his work that he's done to create the training set for the Tas diet. But it's definitely a concern with the ecology of these diatoms that most of the work is related to European. So it's definitely something that needs to be done, and I think I've done what I could to make sure that I'm focusing on some of those local taxa. But it's tricky. And I think you do what you can, but yes, there are some concerns about that. And just even the ecological relationships to fire, we don't really understand. So, work in progress.
I've been involved in a large project that's been looking at the linkages between climate, fire, vegetation, and people in the mid-latitudes during the Holocene. And I want to share some of the results of that project that have to do with the Southern Hemisphere. Just to give us all the same background, when you look at the present day mid-latitude climate of the Southern Hemisphere, it's strongly influenced by the path of the southern westerlies. So here in blue, I've shown you the core in October on average, and that determines the strength and location of storm tracks. But it's also influenced by the position and strength of upper level ridges and troughs, the subtropical high pressure system, and then this is all modulated by interannual and decadal variability. The two regions that we're looking at are Tasmania and northern Patagonia, and as you can see, they're in the area influenced strongly by the westerlies, but also by the strength and position of the subtropical high. The two regions make sense to study and compare because they both have similar climate gradients. So you go from very wet conditions in the west, over 3 meters of precipitation, then over a series of mountain ranges to drier conditions on the east, in both settings. And this is well expressed in the vegetation. So they share similar types of vegetation, of course, different species and different evolutionary histories. But on the west side of both northern Patagonia and Tasmania are closed rainforests dominated by nothofagus and evergreens. And then as you go on the east side of the Andes or the Tasmanian mountains, you get into drier forests and shrublands. Patagonia is such a large region that you then go into a steppe area as you go farther east, and Tasmania doesn't have that vegetation type. So the questions for us have been, how similar are the vegetation and fire histories of northern Patagonia and Tasmania? And then what do these similarities suggest about past climate connections? And then always the outstanding question is, how did people and climate interact to shape past fire regimes? So when you look at the large-scale climate drivers over the last 15,000 years, we're talking about insolation, the annual insolation, as well as the seasonal cycle of insolation. And in this latitude, there's very high summer insolation initially, then it drops down to a low and then increases to the present day. And the opposite occurs for winter. So there's an attenuation of the seasonal cycle in the early Holocene and an amplification of that in the late Holocene. When you look at temperature records coming from Antarctica, you can see a really rapid rise in temperature in the southern hemisphere, a couple of dips, but higher temperatures in the early Holocene, and they steadily decline to the present day and become more variable. And then, of course, is the ENSO variability, the interannual, interdecadal variability that gets amplified in the late Holocene. So from our point of view, you start out with a climate that's cold but warming, cool and warming. And then you move in both regions into a climate that's warm and dry. And then there's a lot of independent proxy that suggests that there's kind of a wet period before you go into this sort of highly variable, cooler kind of climate. So I'm going to keep referring to those 4 climate zones for the rest of the talk. We've looked at pollen and charcoal records from 2 places, Cradle Mountain in Tasmania, and then the mid-latitudes of broad transective sites in Argentina along the steppe forest border. The Tasmanian studies have been done by Laurie Staley, and she's going to be giving a talk this afternoon on those records in more detail. And the Argentine work is the work primarily of Virginia Iglesias and Vera Markgraf. So let me give you a typical record from Cradle Mountain that Laurie's worked on. This is Wombat Pool at latitude 41. You start out with a cool period shown by declining Poaceae and rising arboreal pollen because it's getting warmer. Then you move into a warmer phase characterized by grass and also by sedge and Athrotaxis. The wet period is a period dominated by rainforest taxa. Nothofagus and Philocladus are most notable in the record. And then this highly variable period is a period when eucalyptus expands, and it really sort of interplays with the rainforest taxa Nothofagus through the late Holocene. A simple record from the same latitude in Patagonia shows kind of the similar phasing in the response to climate. There's this high period of Poaceae at the beginning with a lot of Nothofagus, so it's still growing there. There's a warm, dry period that's characterized by a lot of herbaceous taxa like Asteraceae and various shrubs and small trees. And then you go into a wetter phase, which is characterized by Ostracedrus expansion in this region. Ostracedrus is very sensitive to summer precipitation. It requires summer precipitation. And then in the late Holocene, you get this trade-off between Ostracedrus and Nothofagus bouncing back and forward again. So the climate is more variable. We've done GAMS analysis of the records from Tasmania, as well as the records from northern Patagonia. And, they look fairly similar, the histories of tree development in this region. You can see that there's a rise in trees initially. It's much steeper in Patagonia, and at this latitude, it develops fairly abruptly after 15,000 years. Then you have high rainforest abundance increasing and reaching a maximum during the wet period. And then in the late Holocene, the rainforest abundance decreases as you start to get these more pyrophytic tree taxa like eucalyptus and Ostracedrus coming in, and so you see more fluctuations. So in a broad sense, the two regions are quite similar in terms of their history. Now, because we have such a range of sites in Patagonia, we can look at the latitudinal development of forests. So the dots on the left are the sites that we have, and the pink color is an isopol map of tree abundance. So we're just looking at arboreal pollen here. And so where it's very pink, you have a lot of trees. It tells you it's a closed forest. And you can look at this record then with latitude on the y-axis and time on the x-axis and look at the development of forest. One thing to notice is that there's sort of pale pink on the right side of the diagram, telling you that trees are really on the landscape at all latitudes during the history of this region, but there's not closed forest until you get into the more pink phases. You can look at this period and see that there's a period with very little pink, and that's that warm, dry period which sort of stalled forest development in a lot of regions. But the most interesting thing is that you can see this sort of time-transgressive development of closed forest in the region. So in the northern sites, it starts at greater than 15 K. By the time you get to 45 degrees latitude, it's 13 to 14 K. And it's not until about 7 K that you get closed forest developing. And this is following the southward shift of the westerlies. The other interesting thing is when you're in those southern latitudes at 52 to 54, it's very pink. It's very solidly pink. That's the core of the westerlies for the last 6,000 years. Whereas when you look at the more northern latitudes, you can see there's sort of flickering of white and pink. And that's the interannual variability, the ENSO variability, that's really affecting the mid-latitudes more strongly. So just even by looking at the pollen data, you can see this sort of north-south shifting of the southern westerly position. Okay, so the last point is how do people how do people in climate interact in shaping fire regimes? Well, this is a very sort of romanticized notion in both regions, very sort of European constructed notion of fire development. And when you actually look at the actual evidence for whether people or climate are causing fires, it's really pretty inferential. Here's a fire record from Tasmania going back 15,000 years. The bottom graph is the overall charcoal levels, showing you the area burned at this site through time. The middle graph with the vertical lines is fire magnitude, so it's telling you the size of particular fire events. And then the pluses at the top are the individual fire events. So going back to our colors again, you can see that during this cool period, there's very little fire. Then there's a period of extremely high fire in the early Holocene. Then you go into, when it's cooler, you have less fires, and the fires are generally smaller. And then you get into the late Holocene, and the fires are more variable. There's large fires and small fires, including this enormous fire peak at about 3,400 years, which shows at a number of sites in this region. Thank you. Going to the same site that I showed you the pollen data from in Patagonia, the bottom graph here is the fire record. And on top, I have forest trees and shrubland taxa showing. So here's the cool period, has low fire activity. The warm period in many of these sites is a period of rising fire activity, as you can see by the red lines starting to scale up. The wet period is not so well expressed, but it's a little bit lower fire activity and a stronger signature of forest taxa on the top. And then you get into this more interannual variability period with lots of fires. Again, here's a GAMS analysis of fire. You can see the trends are somewhat similar. They both show a rising fire activity as you go into this warm period, and then a decline in fire activity as you move into the wet period. And then the two records slightly depart, with Tasmania being more variable in its fire activity. And I think the reason for that is eucalyptus. There's eucalyptus in Tasmania, and that's very fire adapted, and it's causing a lot more dynamic response to fire. This is the occupation intensity inferred from the archaeological record. So people were in Tasmania for about the last 35,000 years, and there's high occupation intensity around our sites until about 11,000 years ago. Then it pretty much drops off and it increases in the last 5,000 years. Patagonia, people are present, but probably in low populations through the late glacial, and their populations, the occupation intensity doesn't increase until the late Holocene. Well, if you superimpose our climate records on that, what you see is that there's kind of a mismatch between people and the fire record and climate. So during the cool period, when we get little fire, that's the time when most people are in Tasmania. And so their impact on fire regime seems to be pretty negligible. In the warm period, there's more fire, but this is a time when we don't have people. Low fires during the cool period, the wet period. And it's only when you get to the late Holocene where you have variable fire and people that perhaps there's really a strong relationship and people are really maybe influencing the fire regime. So let me make my main points. I think these reconstructions show some joint responses to large-scale controls. First of all, the LGM in both regions seems to be a dry period, given the low number of trees, and this is probably due to a weakened southern westerlies, which is shown in models. Then you see warming and increasing moisture in the late glacial, and this is very clearly expressed in both regions as the advance of trees and the development of a more forested vegetation. It's a very sharp signal in Patagonia, and it's more gradual in Tasmania at comparable latitudes. In Patagonia, we can see this very clear southward shift of the westerlies from 15,000 to 7,000 based on the time when closed forest actually develops. Increased annual and winter insolation create this warm, dry, early Holocene, and winter insolation is probably a really important part of that, and how dry conditions or warm conditions in winter then carry over into the summer fire season. But this is a time of high fire activity in both regions. You see the strengthening of the southern westerlies in ENSO in the middle Holocene by the changes in vegetation and the low fire activity. And then finally, the higher climate variability in the late Holocene is a very strong signal in both regions. And then my last point is humans were certainly an ignition source, and they probably were very locally influential in changing vegetation in the places that they occupied. But they don't seem to be a primary driver of the fire history in either region. The fire history seems better explained by the large-scale climate changes that we see. So thanks very much.
Welcome, everybody. We stay in the region, in Patagonia, and I would like to report you some results we got in the last years about oxygen isotopic composition of components we found in the lakes. And this work was done by a lot of contributors, which are who are listed here, from Germany, Argentina, and Chile. And I would like to start with showing these maps, the left one from Garot and the right one from Patricio Moreno et al. And they nicely show that the patterns of correlation between the strong westerlies in that region at the southern tip of South America and precipitation are different in the western side of the Andes than in the eastern side of the Andes. And this is nicely shown in the colors. The red colors symbolize positive correlation between the wind strength and precipitation, and the blue colors negative correlation. And as you can see, on both sides of the Andes, the correlation is equally strong, but the sign of the correlation coefficient changes. And our record that I want to present you afterwards is from Laguna Potroc-Eiche, Mayr Lake in the steppe region in Argentina, close to the Magellan Strait. But before we go to the sediment record, let's think a little bit about what can influence the isotopic composition of the rainfall in this area. And as you can see, the band of extreme westerlies here in red are located approximately from, let's say, 40 degrees south to 60 degrees south. And in the middle, there is this record, Laguna Potroc-Eiche. And in the last years, we have sampled water samples from this area of Patagonia. And this is just a sketch to show you the crosses are the lake waters we sampled. And the squares reflect the available data from precipitation from the global network of isotopes in precipitation hosted at the IAEA. So unfortunately, directly at the relevant sites, there is no such GNIP station available. So we have to find other solutions, and this is looking at the lake water isotopic compositions. Just some examples. You see the orange dots north of Bahia Blanca. This is in the humid Pampas region, and you nicely see that they have a different evaporation line here. This is the global meteoric water line in black, and all the lake waters are located along a line which is called the evaporation line, and where both crosses is more or less the precipitation of Bahia Blanca. So even if we miss these data, we can derive from such graphs the isotopic composition of the precipitation. And if you go further south into the westerly zones, you see that this crossing point shifts towards lower values. And why is that? Because when the air masses pass over the Andes, then we have considerable fractionation in the westerly zone. So this is a transect at about 50 degrees south latitude, and from the data we so far got, we know that in the moorland and rainforest, with about 7,000 to 8,000 millimeters of precipitation per year, we have a different isotopic composition than east of the Andes in the steppe region with 400 to 200 millimeter precipitation. And this is due to rainout effects when the air masses coming from the Pacific have to pass over the Andes. Preferentially, the heavy water molecules rain out. So we start with a value of about -7 per mil in this area of the islands and fjords in western Patagonia. And when it reaches the eastern part of the steppe region, it's a value of about -15 per mil. And the contribution from the Atlantic is very minor. As you can see, we would expect values of about -8 per mil. And then there is another effect affecting the lake water isotopic composition, and this is evaporation. And of course, the evaporation is much higher in the dry regions, in the steppe, and this leads to considerable fractionation effects as well. So that's why we observe just a small variation of lake water isotopic composition here in the west. Compared to the east, in the steppe region, we have an enrichment of almost up to 20 per mil, but very variable. Well, how can we now transfer this knowledge to our lake records? We have monitored one site in detail for a long period now, and this is the ICTP site Laguna Potroc-Eiche, which you can see in the lower left corner. It's located in the steppe. It's a 100-meter deep lake, a Mayr crater lake, and 3 kilometers in diameter. And over the course of several years, we've taken lake water samples and analyzed the delta 18O composition. You can see that in blue on top. And this nicely correlates to modeled lake water levels in green. And there was a period in 2001 and 2002, here, this first part of the record, where we had extreme wind strength, and this is shown by the wind index. And the wind index means here accumulated days of above average wind strength over a certain period. And as you can see, these were extremely windy years, and the delta 18O values were quite high. And then a period of a more humid period started, and lake levels increased, as well as delta 18O values of the lake water. So we are quite sure that the delta 18O values in this lake are correlated with the wind strength. What proxies do we have in this lake? There is, on the one hand side, typical example of a moss, of an aquatic moss, which is quite abundant in the late glacial and early Holocene, this kind of aquatic moss. And we have done some calibration studies, and you can see that in the left lower corner, where we sampled water plants from several lakes in Patagonia and correlated the delta 18O values of the cellulose we extracted from the plants with the water isotopic composition of the host water. And as you can see, there is a very strong correlation, and the aquatic cellulose directly reflects the host water isotopic composition. So this is a very strong proxy we can use. And on the other side, there are carbonates, and these carbonates in Laguna Potrogaica are very special because carbonate is formed as icate, which is a calcium carbonate hexahydrate, and it only precipitates in a very small range of temperatures. And so we can be sure that also this proxy reflects mainly the lake water isotopic composition and not temperature. So let's go to the records, and this is a record published by Su et al. In 2014 in Climate of the Past. And as you can see here, the red record of the reconstructed lake water isotopic composition from 24,000 to 8,000 shows you some variations which are consistent with what we see in other records, at least the increase of the delta 18O values is consistent with warming in Antarctica and with the rise of CO2 in Antarctic ice cores. But the overall pattern in the late glacial looks different. So there is not an Antarctic cold reversal or a younger dryas, but something which is a mixture. And I have to say that we used a special cellulose extraction method which really provides pure cellulose, and so there are no biasing effects as in previously applied methods for the cellulose extraction from sediments or plants. And we can combine this record in green with the carbonate isotope record. Here also the reconstructed lake water isotope values. Unfortunately, these two records don't overlap much, so there seems to be a considerable change in the whole lake system, which didn't allow the growth of mosses anymore, but then suddenly the carbonate precipitation started. And exactly at that point where this shift occurred, we have an increase, or the most extreme increase in the delta 18O values of the lake water. And this, of course, is interesting to study, and we would like to know if this is more related to evaporation, to extreme evaporation during this period at about 9,000 to 7,000 years ago, or which is less likely to more easterlies. And we can compare this with an older record showing the input of alloctonous forest pollen into Laguna Potrogaica, which is presently about 150 kilometers away from the forest. So we have an extreme influx due to the westerlies of these Andean forest pollen. And so we can use this as a westwind proxy because the forest steppe ecotone boundary didn't shift much during the Holocene, at least in the relevant period. And as you can see here, this increase in the delta 18O values is reflected also in the influx of forest pollen during that time, and it seems as if we have a period of extremely enhanced southern hemisphere westerlies in that period. Now, coming back to the ongoing work, we are now investigating how we could use chironomid head capsules for lake water isotopic reconstructions in that area. There are two more studies. One is from Wang et al., the blue dots, an experimental study, and the black dots are from transect over Europe. And as you can see, our red dots fit quite nicely, so it seems as if the delta 18O values of the chironomid chitin are also a very good and reliable proxy for reconstructing past isotope composition of lakes in this area. So I'm coming to my final slide, and I want to acknowledge all my team partners in the Passado project and in ICDP, and thank the DFG for financing part of this work. And thank you for your attention.
Did I get that right, that you're interpreting more enriched 18O values as more westerly influence?
Yes. Enriched 18O due to more evaporation in the lakes. Because if the westerlies are stronger east of the Andes, you have an extreme enrichment in the delta 18O.
Okay, normally temperate precipitation, higher latitude precipitation is more depleted in 18O.
It relates to this figure. There you can see it.
Good. Sorry. Yeah. Again, excuse me for my inattention.
No problem.
Thank you very much for staying in this last talk right before lunch. And I will just continue with a story that Christoph developed for the westerlies and try to get some more information about the variability of the westerlies in strength and position. So that's our hypothesis, at least. So we will go to a place which is quite close to Laguna Potrock-Eike. Here you can see Laguna Potrock-Eike, this tip of the arrow. No, wait, you can't see that one. Here it is. That's Laguna Potrock-Eike. And we are going a little further to the east towards a lake which is called Laguna Azul. And this lake is also situated in the Pali-Eike volcanic field. And because this lake is quite interesting in terms of its genesis, its formation, I would like to tell you a little bit of how this lake was formed. It's the final stage at a northwest-southeast trending fault line, which you can see here. You see several volcanic eruption centers along this line, and at the northern edge, a phreatomagmatic eruption formed a Mayr lake. The tephra, the pyroclastic tephra, you can see all along the crater rim. And what you can also see is that this crater and the catchment area is composed of a vegetation which is made of Patagonian steppe, no tree whatsoever. After this formation of the depression, a lava lake filled the entire crater up to the rim, and lava poured to the north and circled in blue. And this lava was actually dated to about 10,000 years ago by argon dating. After a while, this lava drained back into the vent of the volcano, and the solidified crust on top just dropped to the side walls of the crater, which you can see on this figure to the left. And then only the lake formed in this depression, a 56-meter deep lake as it is today. From this site, we recovered Sediment cores, 7.5 meter long, mostly highly organic, only the base is a little bit more mineralic in composition. You can see that there is a lot of gas in the uppermost part of the record. We have 2 tephra layers encircled, and at the very base there is basaltic scoria. So we are quite sure that we recovered the entire lacustrine sediment record of this site. The lithology is made of dark or kind of blackish, dark gray material, which is a little bit more of organic composition and then turns into brownish, not laminated stuff. This is in green dry bulk density, in red magnetic susceptibility, in blue titanium content, and finally total organic carbon. And what you can see is the basal scoria, which is clearly evident by all parameters. You can see the tephra layers also visible in all parameters. There are additional 2 sandy layers related to lake level fluctuations. And overall, the entire record gives us the impression that the sediments turn from more mineralic to more organic through the development of time, so that would also be a nice example for lake ontogeny. Now, let's go to dating. We use AMS radiocarbon dates on bulk organic matter. And before that, we tested for the reservoir effect, which is not present at all. So we got a chronology down to 640 centimeters, which is in itself consistent. However, at the very base, we got dates that are not really consistent with their stratigraphic position. Last glacial maximum and even older are the ages, and they are age reversals. So what's going on here? So hard water effect is not possible. So the only explanation we have so far is that we have juvenile CO2 emanating from the still slightly active volcano underneath the whole crater system. And this interpretation would agree, of course, with the age of the whole crater, which is 10,000 years, so let's say late glacial of age, and also with the pollen stratigraphy, which gives us information that there is no last glacial maximum pollen record present, so it must be younger. So we would agree with our radiocarbon chronology, and we exclude these lowermost 4 ages from our chronology. Doing that, we come up with a chronology for our multi-proxy dataset, and I show you the total sulfur record in yellow, in blue the iron-manganese ratio, in red carbon-13 data, in green a diatom record of the diatom species Thalassosyra patagonica, and finally in olive a pollen species, this is Notophagus. And I want to walk you through this multi-proxy data sets in 3 steps and begin with the early Holocene, which is marked here, and focus first on the Notophagus record, as Christoph already pointed out, and as you have shown on the figure of the catchment area, there is no tree around in the catchment area. So everything has to come from the west, from the Andes foothills, which is about 100-150 kilometers away. So to get this to the side of Laguna Azul, we need westerly winds. So all these pollen are long-distance pollen. The diatom, Thalassosyra patagonica, is a diatom that indicates strong salinity. So what we find here is that we have a clear increase in salinity during this early phase of the record. If you look at the stable isotopes, there's a remarkable drop of 10 per mil in the record, and this can only be interpreted as a result of methanogenesis. So, assuming that, we would have to argue that there must be strong anoxic condition at the surface sediments or at the sediment-water interface. And exactly that is evidenced by the iron manganese record. We have a clear maximum which indicates anoxic conditions. Furthermore, we have the sulfur, and the sulfur is of course bound in the sediment to iron sulfides under anoxic conditions. So also that is pointing to anoxic conditions, so that we as a whole interpret this section as being the result of strong anoxia. Actually, we interpret this as the result of a very rare ectogenic mirror mixes that has developed during the early Holocene at Laguna Azul. Now let's go to step 2 and check the uppermost part of the record, the late Holocene, where we also have a notophagus increase, and we also interpret this as long-distant pollen. However, there is no higher salinity indicated by the diatoms. There is no methanogenesis indicated by carbon isotopes, but there is an anoxic condition indicated by iron manganese ratio. However, nothing comparable like in the early Holocene for the sulfur. So what's going on now? We assume that we have anoxia, but weak anoxia, which might be seasonal and not perennial like during meromictic conditions. And this is a situation like it is today. We have seasonal anoxia in Laguna Azul. Now for step 3, if we look into the center of the record, there is not so much notophagus pollen, so obviously the westerly winds decreased. We have no evidence of higher salinity and no evidence of anoxic conditions. So we think this is kind of axic conditions for Laguna Potrokaike during the mid-Holocene. So what is the interpretation of these records? So we think that this is related to the presence or intensity, or both, of the westerly winds. So we have strong westerly winds at the beginning of the record in the early Holocene. Then the influence of the westerlies weakens and finally increases again slightly, not as much as during the early Holocene. So how can we explain that? And for that, we have a look at the atmospheric circulation. At the end of the last glacier, the ITCZ and the southern westerlies moved southward in response to the flatter temperature gradient between equator and South Pole. I think that's common knowledge. However, the southward shift of the westerlies was not uniform and not unidirectional. So maximum wind speeds are expected for the early Holocene when sea ice and glaciers in and around Antarctica and glaciers in the Andes of South America are decreasing but still quite extensive. After the sea ice and glaciers retreated to their minimum during the mid-Holocene, the maximum intensity belt of the westerlies moved further south towards Tierra del Fuego, and that induces a decrease in the west wind intensity at our site Laguna Azul. Finally, during the late Holocene, we have an increase in westerlies again. There's a kind of global cooling going on during the late Holocene, starting around 5,000, maybe 4,000 years ago, and this increased the westerly intensity again at Laguna Azul. So, to show you this in a kind of graphic image, during the last glacial maximum, the westerlies were somewhere between 40 and 45 south. Then they moved to our side at 52 degrees south, and then to Tierra del Fuego in the mid-Holocene, and back to our site at Laguna Azul. So position and intensity changed. The position is clear here. Whether the intensity changed from the early Holocene to the late Holocene is only indicated by the intensity of the anoxic conditions at our site. So we assume that it's less intense, but how much less is difficult to say. So now the question might arise, how about the last couple of centuries? What's going on here? It's difficult to say because we have human influence. This began around 1500 when European settlers arrived and was intensified during the 18th century when lake eutrophication is indicated by Cephalodiscus parvus, and finally we got sheep farmers arriving, causing soil erosion and the spread of weeds in the region, indicated by Rumex in this case. So it's not as simple to interpret the final record, but there is evidence of lake level variability, of changes that are probably related to westerly intensity changes, which are far more complex and much more variable than the very rough interpretation of the three phases I presented before indicate. So there's lots of more of information to be taken out of this record in the next steps. So, Laguna Azul is a rather young volcanic lake in South America. Its sediments integrate environmental, climatic, and human impacts. And we have at the early Holocene the rare occurrence of an ectogenic mirror-mixes, which is documented by a drastic lake level drop. And the multi-proxy analysis allow rough estimation about position and intensity of the westerlies for certain times of the Holocene. And finally, human impact obscures the last couple of centuries and make it difficult to have a clear forward or straightforward interpretation in terms of climatic conditions. Thank you very much for your attention and hope you have a great lunch.
I have a question for you regarding the interpretation of Nothofagus, because you interpret Nothofagus as an extra-local signal, and you interpret it as a signal coming from the west. However, Nothofagus is also present south in Tierra del Fuego, and so your interpretation of stronger westerlies might also be in conflict, perhaps, with incursions of Antarctic air masses coming from the south at times of weak westerly flow, in particular during the early Holocene. Would you comment on this, please?
I think the air masses coming from the south would have more moisture, so we would have not a drastic decrease in lake levels, which is evident. So, and an increase in salinity related to that. So I would assume that the southermost winds or southwestern winds would have more moisture, so that's one point. The other point is that I cannot imagine that westerly winds that come from southwest, well, they could probably take some Nothofagus pollen with them, but yeah, that needs to be debated. But I think it would cause more precipitation at the site if you have southwesterly winds, and that's not evidenced in our case.
Yeah, because during the early Holocene, the western sites show weaker westerly influence, but we can discuss that further. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I wonder if you analyzed grain size in the detritic material in your record, and if you did, what are the numbers of this?
We did not analyze grain size because the sediment is mostly organic, and there is very few detritic material. There is no inflowing river, so the only material that you can expect is either from shoreline erosion, like the sandy layers, these two that we have, or introduced by aeolian processes. And that's very minor.